Hello everybody and welcome to Module 6 of the Disarmament Orientation course. This is the last of the preparatory videos and we will touch on a number of technologies that from a disarmament perspective have so far largely defied international regulation. These technologies include information and communication technologies, cyber and lethal autonomous weapons. These novel technologies have already and will continue to change the nature of warfare. That much we know already. What the international community is struggling with is how to reduce the risks for international peace and stability associated with the use and with the misuse of these technologies. First up, we have Giacomo Persi-Parli, who is the program lead for security of the Security and Technology program at UNIDIR. And Giacomo will explain to us why emerging technology is relevant to arms control and explain to us some key terms and definitions of this rather complex issue areas. Quite obviously, the private sector, which is developing many of these technologies, is key to finding effective regulations. To illustrate this point, there's a video from Microsoft on the dangers of misuse of information technologies. So let's get started here.
To talk about security and technology, and we're very pleased to have Giacomo Persi-Parli, who's the program lead for SecTech, as they call it, at UNIDIR. Why is all this important to disarmament and arms control, and why, for example, did UNIDIR decide to set up a security and technology program?
We can say that, in a way, arms control has always been technology-driven, right? There's always been some advancements in weapon systems, in armaments, that somehow triggered the need of discussing the impact that such armaments and such technology could have on strategic stability and international security. What we've seen is that in the last 20 years, the pace of technological development has increased exponentially. And enabling technologies such as the digital ones have become embedded in so many different domains related to arms control. We're thinking and talking about the implication of digital technologies and AI, ranging from conventional down to nuclear, chemical and biological and everything in between. So really what these emerging technologies have done is really boost the technological advancements in all the ranges and domains that are of relevance for arms control. So they not only have a potentially destabilizing effect in their own merit, if we think about cyber or laws, but also they're enabling technologies that can really change the way conflicts are fought and the way conflicts are prevented in many other domains.
So, Giacomo, for many diplomats and indeed other people, this area is full of difficult terminology and acronyms and a lot of tech talk. So perhaps we could start, just if you take us through some of the terms when we talk about ICT and AI and cybersecurity and laws. I mean, what is this stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for the question, because I think that the problem of terminology is probably one of the key components of the difficulty in having multilateral discussions on these topics. For all of the terms that you've mentioned, there is no universally accepted definition. That means that every country or every sector, whether it's the private, even within the private sector, different branches of the private sector, give definitions in their own specific way. So this leaves open to opportunity for interpretation, and when there is opportunity for interpretation, clearly there are issues when you're trying to establish a common ground. But if we have to think about broad definitions and broad scope, ICT basically encapsulates all of the technology that allows people, businesses, and organizations to interact in the digital world. It's a combination of internet, both infrastructure, but also kind of the applications, the software, so everything that enables communication on the internet, mobile networks, legacy communication networks such as phone lines and such, but also going forward, cloud computing, AI, artificial intelligence, all of this kind of cutting-edge technology is also part of the very broad definition of ICT. You mentioned cyber. Now, cyber is, again, a terminology that is so broad and lacks a proper definition or a university accepted definition. Cybersecurity can mean a lot of things. It can range from one end of the spectrum to cyber hygiene, which means all of the behaviors that individuals, organizations, and businesses can implement to ensure a more safe and responsible behavior. Cyber hygiene means making sure that if you're not sitting at your desk, you log off your session, or you don't leave your passwords on your desk. So very basic behaviors that can have ultimately a very significant impact on security. Down to cyber defense, which is the more if you want, like state-centered concept of cybersecurity, where you have state actors that deploy cyber defense strategies and policies and instruments in order to protect their own networks. Of course, in between these two, there is a whole gray zone made of cybercrime made by cyber individuals or criminal organizations that are increasingly operating in the cyberspace, and sometimes even matching state actors when it comes to capabilities. And like everything that can be in a way used for defensive purpose, there is also the other side of the coin, which is cyber offensive capabilities. Now, there is already quite a high number of states that have publicly declared, without of course getting into the details of what they can do, but they have declared that they have the capability of conducting offensive cyber operations.
Я думаю, что наша страна находится в стадии войны, поэтому мы можем много что рассказать общественности, мировой общественности и показать все-таки лицо кибервойны.
A global cyber attack.
We've never seen anything on this scale.
It can travel from computer to computer. Hospitals paralyzed, computers had shut down.
WannaCry is different.
I think WannaCry is a great example of how nation states are impacting businesses and ultimately individuals as well.
We had over 19,000 appointments cancelled, and those are people who are worried about their cancer appointment or their appointment for an operation.
I was diagnosed with a heart murmur, which was the start of the hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. It's a very serious surgery. Wanted my life back. After I'd had my chest shaved at 6 o'clock in the morning, the doctor looked very, not upset, but concerned, shall we say, and he said, "We've been hacked. All our systems are down across the whole hospital."
He telephoned me, obviously, and said, "It's not going to happen," and he was in shock.
Suddenly we discovered that a bit of our society, a bit of our social infrastructure could be switched off. WannaCry, it was a kind of a warning shot.
The malware crippled computers across Ukraine.
Perhaps the most sophisticated in a series of attacks, taking control of computers and demanding digital ransom. The list of companies impacted around the world is growing.
I think what NotPetya represents is not just the evolution of the attack in terms of the methodologies involved, but also the evolution of intent.
Ну, чтобы понимать, что за 2,5 часа, 10 часов утра, пол Украины уже было поражено.
We have TV stations who've been on the air when their computers just died.
You cannot receive cash in ATM machine because ATMs also doesn't work. It was a real shock for Kyiv citizens.
75% of my clients were affected by Petya. Some companies were destroyed totally. They didn't understand why they're losing their job. Everybody is just thinking, we hope this will never happen again, but I'm afraid this will happen again.
One of the objectives in the cyber attacks we face is disruption. To stop operating, to create significant burden to the life of citizens, governments, businesses, where the cost of doing business or recovering is extremely high.
In 2017, a lot was the same. Cyber attacks were happening, they were affecting organisations. What changed was the impact on our lives.
It was the most awful time because I didn't know what was going to happen now.
Stop and think about what it means in real terms to real people. It isn't a machine you're affecting, and if it is, maybe that machine's keeping somebody alive.
Ultimately, all of us pay the price when it comes to nations in particular who are attacking each other by using us as the means. What are we doing to come together? If we don't have this conversation now, when it happens and we all retreat behind walls, that is when this becomes a catastrophic event globally. And we need to do everything we can to at least talk about these issues before it happens.
Now that we have learned more about some of the basic terms and concepts that are important for regulating emerging technologies, let's look at cyber technology. Next up, we have Kerstin Vignard, who's currently leading the UNIDIR team, supporting the chairman of the latest group of governmental experts on cybersecurity and the Openended working group. Kerstin will not only summarize the state of affairs in these two bodies, but will also explain how a group of governmental experts and open-ended working groups function and what their purpose is. So over to you, Kerstin.
Thanks, Oliver. I've been leading UNIDIR's team supporting the chairs to all the UN processes on cybersecurity since 2009. So I'd like to give you a primer of sorts on the UN negotiations on international cybersecurity, and that's the groups of governmental experts, the GGEs, the open-ended working groups, the OEWGs, and I'll even touch on at the end a new proposal, which is called the Program of Action, the POA. And I think this is important. I started my career, I thought understanding that substance was much more important than understanding process. And over the years, I've seen many delegations be completely outmaneuvered, not because they didn't have a strong national position or an understanding of the subject, but because they didn't have a firm grasp of the process. For example, in our field of disarmament, we have two completely different processes, both confusingly called GGEs. We have the GGEs established by the first committee, which I'll be talking about here, and then we have GGEs established by the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, which confusingly, while they have the same name, they are organized completely differently, they have different rules of procedure, they have different levels of transparency, and they have different rules of participation and decision-making. So it's really important to understand the differences. So with that, let's dive right in. So some are surprised to learn that cybersecurity issues have been on the UN's agenda for over 20 years. Back in 1998, we had the first Russian-sponsored resolution at the General Assembly, and then afterwards these became annual resolutions. In 2004, we had the first closed-door negotiation, the first group of governmental experts on developments in the field of information and telecommunications in the context of international security, ICTs. These are essentially the code word for cyber in the UN, ICTs. And we've had now 6 of those. As of today, which is the 19th of May, we've had 5 GGEs concluded, 3 of which have issued consensus reports, and a 6th one, which is going to be concluding its work in about 10 days from now. In fact, I'm recording this from New York, where I will be in the final session of the 6th GGE next week. GGEs are convened by the Secretary General at the request of the General Assembly. The first committee, the Disarmament International Security Committee, passes a resolution asking the Secretary General, with the assistance of a group of governmental experts, to undertake a study and submit a report to the General Assembly at a later session. Now, the mandate and the size and the number of sessions are crafted in consultations with member states and in negotiations at First Committee, and there's, of course, budgetary and political considerations to be mindful of. Now, GGEs are composed on the basis of equitable geographical distribution. 5 permanent members of the Security Council are traditionally offered a seat on all GGEs, and the remaining seats are allocated among UN regional groupings. And states often send an official request or they lobby for a seat on a GGE that is of particular interest to them. The Secretary General is the one who determines the composition of the group, taking into account a lot of different factors, including geographical and political balance, demonstrated interest in the topic, the number of times that country has served on other GGEs, or whether they're currently serving on a different GGE, all of that together. Now, the fact that GGEs are established by the First Committee has important implications for the group's mandate. The First Committee deals only with items on the international disarmament agenda. Issues that aren't under the purview of First Committee, such as espionage, internet governance, crime, terrorism, development, digital privacy, human rights, all of those are usually seen by the GGE experts as outside the purview of the GGE, although everybody wants to bring one of whatever their favorite issue is, they want to bring it to the table. So there's always maybe a mention of it, but it's outside the mandate of the GGE. Now, you have a cast of characters in a GGE. You have the experts themselves, you have the chairperson who's selected from among the members of the group, you have the secretary, and the secretary isn't a person, it's a function. It's a function performed by the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs, and it helps to both administer the group and also brings that substantive knowledge to it. The consultant, again, this is a function, not a person. The UN Institute for Disarmament Research has been the consultant for all but the first UN GGE on ICTs. And the consultant's role is to assist the chair to synthesize the group's discussions, to offer briefings, background, to advise the chair, and to do a lot of the drafting of the report. Now, once the GGE composition has been approved by the Secretary General, each country is asked to nominate an expert. The experts serve in their individual capacities. They sit behind nameplates that have their own name, their family name, not their country's name. And in almost all cases, these experts are governmental officials, mostly from ministries of foreign affairs, although they might come from the Department of Defense, or they can come from sometimes telecommunication ministries. Now, at the beginning, there was a mix of technical and political experts, but the GGE is a political discussion. It's not a technical one, and over time, it's really shifted to being much more political expertise. Lastly, in the Secretary General's disarmament agenda, item 37, the Secretary General commits to achieve gender parity in all panels, boards, expert group, and other bodies established under his auspices in the field of disarmament. So now, when nominating experts, countries often take into account the issue of gender balance. Some experts who come to the meetings are accompanied by advisors. That could be legal advisors, military advisors, or others. Now, if they come from capital, this is at the country's own expense, and other experts might have support from their permanent missions in New York or Geneva, depending on where the GGE is meeting. Most GGEs meet for 4 one-week in-person sessions, and of course, during COVID, new methods of online work were adopted. We had quite a few virtual meetings, informal meetings without interpretation, to help fill the gap when meetings were postponed due to COVID or delayed. Now, the 6th GGE, the one that we're currently in right now, for the first time in its mandate included a mechanism for consultations, both at the regional level, as well as to gather views of all member states via informal consultations in New York. There's sometimes intercessional work, like commenting on drafts and having informal consultations with different groupings. Now, it's really important to know that in GGE, the meetings are closed. There's no meeting summaries, there's no proceedings, there's no observers, there's no notes, there's no press releases. Not even UN departments or specialized agencies are invited to come witness the discussions. So that means that there's really only 2 publicly available documents concerning a GGE. You have the mandate going in, and then you have the report itself coming out the other side. And these are both GA documents. And the fact that there are only 2 publicly available documents really makes it challenging for new experts, or really anyone outside of the room itself, to really understand the context of how agreements were reached in previous reports. You have to really read between the lines in a GG report. GGEs operate by consensus. The whole group must agree on the report in its entirety. It is possible for a GGE not to reach consensus on a report. That happened at the very first one in 2005. It happened in the last completed one, which is completed in 2017, failed to reach consensus as well. GGE recommendations are not legally binding. GGE reports, if you reach a consensus report, they provide advice and suggestions to the General Assembly, to the Secretary General, and to member states. And via its report, the group asks member states to, for example, actively consider the recommendations within the report and how they might be implemented. First Committee, for its part, generally welcomes the GGE report. However, the 2015 report has a slightly different status. The General Assembly went beyond simply recognizing the report, but rather, via consensus resolution, it called on all member states to be guided in their use of information and communication technologies by the recommendations and assessments of the 2015 report. So when you hear that the latest GGE or the recently concluded OEWG, the Open-Ended Working Group, is not starting from scratch, it's on that basis that all member states have already agreed to be guided by the 2015 report. Now, some substantive highlights. The 2010 report established the international negotiating agenda for cybersecurity, calling on the international community to undertake work to develop norms of responsible state behavior, confidence building measures, and actions to build cybersecurity capability on a global basis. 2013, big highlight. Started to put together the normative framework, but the affirmation that international law applies to cyberspace was a big win in 2013. 2015 was probably the peak of the process, where we had the group proposed 11 norms of responsible state behavior, and these were the ones that all member states agreed to be guided by via that consensus GA document that I just mentioned a moment ago. And in 2017, we didn't reach consensus, and we'll know in a week or so whether 2021 was able to reach a report or not. Turning now to the Open-Ended Working Group, the OEWG, the recently concluded one, concluded in March 2021. The name open-ended is a bit confusing because it isn't open-ended in its duration. It is open-ended in its composition, meaning it's open to all member states. While the mandate of the GGE and the OEWG were very, very similar, there were key differences on the process side. In the OEWG had observers, like regional organizations and others. It was transparent. All of its formal meetings were webcasts. There were statements posted online on the UNODA's website. And there was also an informal consultation with private sector and civil society. Now, it was originally scheduled to meet in 3 one-week sessions and conclude in July 2020. But the pandemic meant that several postponements happened in the process, and that meant it only concluded in March 2021. We had several online virtual meetings between April 2020 and March 2021, which that extra time actually helped us enrich the report and make it a much deeper report. Now, what came out of the OEWG? To be honest, nothing really new came out of substantive content. This is definitely a time where process matters more than substance. What we got was a reaffirmation of the acquis of previous GGEs by the whole membership of the UN. And process-wise, it frankly was overdue to widen the discussion to invite all member states to the table, take it out of a closed-door negotiating process, bring it to the whole UN memberships. It acknowledges that these issues are multi-stakeholder, that we need the input of private sector, that we need civil society and academia participating in these conversations. The fact that it was open and transparent brings a different kind of weight and legitimacy to the process. And it was really an opportunity to build relationships, to sensitize the community, to build awareness of the acquis and build some capacity. Now, although I should probably tell you one other thing. There's also a chair summary which was not a consensus document. It's a big deal to get a consensus document amongst all member states. We got that in the substantive report. The chair summary was actually part of the substantive report negotiations up until the very end, but it was clear that we were not going to reach consensus on an assessment of the factual discussions, reflecting the variety, the range of positions that were put forward. And so in the final week of negotiations, the chair took that out of the report, took it off the table, and said that he would issue that under his own responsibility. So It is the chair's summary. It did not meet consensus, but you should keep in mind when you read it, and I recommend that you read it because it gives you the variety, the depth, perception of the depth of the views that were expressed. It helps you understand the differences that are out there that we still need to work through in the international community. But keep in mind that that actually was a negotiated text for about 8 months. So it's not just the chair's personal reflections on the process. It really was negotiated up until the very end. We have a new OEWG starting. Although the 2019 OEWG was mandated to study and make recommendations about the future regular institutional dialogue, in the fall of 2020, the first committee voted to establish a new 5-year OEWG, even before the existing OEWG concluded its work. It's not an extension or a continuation of the previous OEWG. It's a new body, it's a new mandate. It has different wording. It's quite ambitious, the mandate. It foresees the possibility of establishing like subgroups to work on specific topics. The organizational session is coming right up here at the beginning of June, and the first substantive session will happen at the end of the year. So this is going to have going to be discussing for the next 5 years kind of the evergreen substantive issues, the need for a legally binding instrument or not, whether new norms are necessary or not, how does international law apply to cyber. But big questions ahead also include the role of other stakeholders in this new process and how to reach consensus on annual progress reports to the General Assembly. If the Conference on Disarmament is any example, even reaching consensus on the basics, we came, we met, and we didn't agree on anything substantive sorts of reports, well, those are increasingly contentious. And then, of course, looking ahead to the final report of the new OEWG in 2025. You know, negotiating consensus reports in 10 days or less of meetings a year is a really challenging thing. I'd be remiss not to mention a final proposal that's on the table. It's a proposal for a program of action, POA, a cyber POA. Now, this is inspired by the 2001 Program of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons, which was a politically binding declaration and essentially an action agenda for the international community to deal with illicit small arms and light weapons. Doing something like this in the cyber domain was suggested by Egypt at the very first meeting of the OEWG back in September 2019, and France and Egypt, along with some other sponsors, proposed this at the OEWG as a format for regular institutional dialogue. Now, since it was proposed, but this other new OEWG had already been passed by the GA, it's mentioned as a recommendation that it's a possibility to have a program of action, something that would really focus on implementation as opposed to developing new things. But it wasn't, there wasn't consensus on the membership to recommend it as a standalone thing. It's possible it could be incorporated into the new OEWG. It's possible that a group of states could take it forward to the General Assembly, to First Committee in the fall and have a separate process, just like we had the GGE and OEWG meeting in parallel for the last 2 years. There are tons of good resources about the substance of these processes. You have the GGE reports, consensus reports, you have the OEWG report and the chair's summary. You have UNIDIR Cyber Policy Portal, ODA's online cyber diplomacy course. UNIDIR on its website, you can download some cheat sheets which summarize the agreements of the GGE reports, the recommendation, what it says about international law, what sort of confidence building measures have been agreed. And of course, you have all those national OEWG statements online on ODA's website. So altogether, there is a lot of content out there. So with that, I'm going to draw this to a close. I hope you found that interesting. Most of what I said about GGEs is applicable to all GGEs in general. It doesn't really matter which subject we're talking about. It could be on missiles. GGEs generally work in those ways. So hopefully that was useful for other content as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Oliver. Thanks.
Thank you, Kerstin. We now turn back to Giacomo, who will explain in some more detail the conceptual problems associated with the regulation of artificial intelligence and how to prevent the misuse of cyber technology. Giacomo will then summarize how the international community has tried to tackle the challenges associated with lethal autonomous weapons. We then have a part of a speech of UN Secretary General Guterres, who talks about the dangers of weaponization of artificial intelligence. There's another video of the campaign to stop killer robots, showing some of the dangers that lethal autonomous weapons might pose to international peace. And finally, you will see Giacomo in a UNIDIR video on the implications of swarm robotics for warfare. So let's dive right in.
I've mentioned AI. What is artificial intelligence? That's the million-dollar question. I think there is often a lot of confusion between what AI is and what an AI system is composed of. So if we look at an AI systems are normally composed of different parts. And any AI system, in order to operate, requires data. So there is a part of the system whose job is to acquire data from the environment, physical or digital, in which the system is deployed. This data is then processed, so that's another component of the AI system, the processing unit, and then fed into a decision-making component, the brain, the digital brain of the system. And that's where you hear a lot of reference to machine learning and different ways in which the system processes the data and comes out with a course of action. Once the course of action is established, then that decision has to be transmitted into something called an actuator. So whether it's physical or digital, the decision has to be transformed into an effect. So the way that an AI system achieves effect is to the form of actuators. It can be a robotic arm, if we're thinking about a physical system, or it can be a digital command, if we're thinking about the cyber domain. Sometimes people conflate AI systems with the decision-making part of the AI system, which is where machine learning, which is where very complicated kind of algorithmic computational processes take place. So these two terms are often used interchangeably, but they mean different things.
And laws.
Laws. Laws stands for Lethal Autonomous Weapon Systems. Yet again, another term that isn't formally defined in a very specific way. But in the context of the UN, the laws was established as a term to refer to those autonomous weapon systems that are able to select and engage a target without meaningful human intervention, or with various degrees of human control. Now, the issue of laws is particularly interesting because for, I believe the first time, the UN is not being reactive to a technology that is being deployed and that is proven to achieve undesirable effects, but is trying to be proactive. And none of the lethal autonomous weapon systems per se have already been fielded. There are some capabilities that have the potential of being used in a fully autonomous modality, but for now, the UN is trying to remain ahead of the curve by discussing the parameters under which this kind of technology can be admissible and used in the context of an armed conflict before such technology is actually fully deployed and turned into a military capability. A lot of this technology is still at the experimental stage, although it builds on a significant and solid basis of commercial uses and applications that have been studied in the past decades. If we think about all of the advancements that have been made, for example, in autonomous driving, well, that same technology is now being looked at in the military domain with the addition of, well, what happens if you're arming the vehicle. So it's not only autonomous driving, but it's potentially autonomous driving and identification of a target and engagement. So within the context of the UN, laws are debated in the group of governmental experts on laws, which is a body, if you want, within the CCW, so the certain conventional weapons. And why is this important? It's because by virtue of being part of the CCW, all of the discussions are looking at this technology from a humanitarian perspective. So we're looking at the legality and the legal compliance of this technology in the context of armed conflict. For example, there is no discussion within the UN of how the development and deployment of such technology could potentially change strategic stability or more kind of international security related issues. The debate is pretty much focused on kind of the humanitarian element, the international law, international humanitarian law element. So that's the angle at which the UN is addressing this issue. But again, it's important that they're thinking about these challenges before they're actually fielded.
The weaponization of artificial intelligence is a serious danger. And the prospect of machines that have the capacity by themselves to select and destroy targets is creating enormous difficulties, or will create enormous difficulties, to avoid the escalation in conflict and to guarantee that international humanitarian law and human rights law are respected in the battlefields. And for me, there is a message that is very clear. Machines that have the power and the discretion to take human lives are politically unacceptable, are morally repugnant, and should be banned by international law.
The siren sounded very loudly, and I just sat there for a few seconds, staring at the screen with the word "launch" displayed in bold red letters. A minute later, the siren went off again. The second missile was launched, then the third, and the fourth, and the fifth. The computers changed their alerts from launch to missile strike, but we knew that every second of delay took away valuable time. I made my decision. I would not trust the computer and reported that the alarm was false. But I, myself, was not sure.
Increasing advances in robotics are transforming many industries, from manufacturing to transportation and warehouse management. Similarly, developments in robotics are changing the way in which wars are fought. Individually, robotic systems provide significant advantages, such as extended range, greater resilience, and more dangerous concepts of operations than possible or acceptable with personnel or manned systems. Collectively, robotic systems may present even more disruptive changes to the conduct of military operations. Swarming as a concept is not new. Swarms can be found first and foremost in nature. Think of flocks of birds or schools of fish foraging or defending against predators. In these swarms, individuals do not need sophisticated knowledge to produce complex collective behaviors, and typically there is no group leader that guides all the other individuals in accomplishing their goal or task. However, swarming is not limited to natural phenomena. It is also a long-standing military tactic that occurs when several units converge to attack a target from multiple axes in a deliberately structured and coordinated way. This type of swarming has occurred throughout military history, ranging from the behavior of horse archers in the 4th century to swarm-like capabilities that simultaneously target multiple vulnerabilities, devices, and access points in the cyberspace.
Swarming is more than just a tactic. Swarming is ultimately a new way of thinking about command and control over military forces. Today, one person controls one robot, but this is a very limiting paradigm for thinking about how to use robots on the battlefield. Swarming allows militaries to move to a new paradigm where one person can control many robots at the same time.
Robotic systems are enabled by the integration of 3 key capabilities. First, sense. Robots need sensors to gather data about their environment. Second, decide. Robots need also to make sense of that data and turn it into purposeful plans and actions. And last, act. The decisions of the robots are extended in the real world through their end effectors and actuators. If we combine the concept of swarms with robotic systems, we have robotic swarms. There are 5 key characteristics of a robotic swarm. The first one is mass. There is no magic number, and in theory, swarms may vary from, as few as a couple of units to thousands of units. While it could be said that quantity has a quality of its own, the optimal size of a swarm will ultimately depend on the swarm's capabilities and the mission it is assigned. The second is diversity. While swarms are regularly portrayed as a large number of exact copies of robotic units, a robotic swarm can be heterogeneous. This means that a robotic swarm can mix simple and more complex robots, or manned and unmanned systems, or it can also be a cross-domain swarm with robots operating in the air, land, and sea. The third characteristic, and possibly the most important one, is collective and collaborative behavior. Now, experts agree that for swarms to be different from simply large numbers of individual robots, they need to exhibit collective behavior that involves collaborating among individual units and with the environment. Considering this, many swarm demonstrations, such as Intel's drone light show during the 2018 Winter Olympic Games, may not be considered true swarming if individual robots were simply following their pre-programmed flight paths. To achieve collaborative behavior, some form of communication to allow for information exchange among the robots is necessary. Communication may take different forms and be both explicit or implicit. Particularly in a military environment, explicit communication is vulnerable to attacks, such as spoofing, jamming, or hacking. An implicit form of communication is, for example, the modeling of behavior. Think of sports team, where individual players have a mental model of what the other players on the team will be doing because they're all running the same play. Now, this is not dissimilar to military tactics, where battle drills are used to train teams to execute coordinated maneuvers with limited or no explicit communication among them. The fifth and last characteristic is autonomy and decentralization. While swarms ultimately operate at the direction of human decision makers, it does not mean that humans control the behavior of each individual robot. Instead, they exercise control over the swarm as a whole. For example, a human operator would select which target should be attacked and would authorize the swarm as a whole to engage, while the swarm would coordinate which of its units should carry out the attack according to a list of parameters, for example, proximity or payload.
One of the most significant advantages for militaries will be the ability to use swarms to have military forces that are more adaptable and responsive at the battlefield's edge to adversarial behavior.
Today's swarms, in the civilian and military domain, are either under development or still in a testing and demonstration phase. In our report, we have identified 8 military applications currently being researched and developed. For example, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance operations. So swarms may be tasked to search a defined area, for example, to find potential targets. None of the projects we have identified are said to have reached the operational stage. Designing, developing, and testing swarms in structured environments, like a lab, or relatively uncluttered environments, for example in controlled airspace, is only the beginning. Deploying the same technology in an environment that is uncontrolled, unstructured, and potentially hostile presents many more challenges. Since governments began expert meetings on lethal autonomous weapon systems, or laws, in the context of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons back in 2014, the issue of maintaining human control over emerging technologies in the area of laws has been one of the main shared objectives.
Discussions on lethal autonomous weapon systems in Geneva have focused on human control, or more accurately, human involvement and oversight. This is crucial to ensuring accountability under international humanitarian law. Swarms will likely challenge ways in which humans exercise control in military operations. For practical reasons related to the operational context, direct control of individual units in a swarm may become difficult and even counterproductive. Through the interaction of individual units with one another and with the environment, collective behavior may arise. This will be emergent and hard to predict. As the sophistication of the machine-to-machine and swarm-to-surrounding interaction grows, for human involvement and oversight to remain effective, it must increasingly focus on the swarm as a whole rather than on its individual components. How humans, potentially accountable under IHL, engage with this collective behavior will be an important challenge for the future.
UNIDIR's study on robotic swarms is designed to help disarmament practitioners and policymakers better understand how swarms operate and what is new or significant about them for autonomous systems. In so doing, we hope to contribute to ongoing discussions amongst member states and the global community about the appropriate levels of human control in lethal autonomous weapon systems. Technological innovation challenges our theories and our practice of war. They also challenge the instruments, the principles, and the practice of arms control. UNIDIR's SecTech program helps us analyze and understand the risks and opportunities presented by new technologies and offers us practical policy options to help take advantage of the benefits and address the risks posed by new technologies.
After these somewhat disquieting videos, let us focus on possible solutions to the challenges that emerging technologies pose to international peace and security. Hye-Gyun Jung of UNODA will talk about the GGE on lethal autonomous weapons, and Giacomo will discuss how the private sector can contribute to regulations.
Intergovernmental discussions on lethal autonomous weapon systems started in 2014 when an informal meeting was held in the framework of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, the CCW, which you covered in the module on conventional weapons. This informal meeting continued until 2016. Then, in late 2016, the high contracting parties to the CCW decided to establish an open-ended group of governmental experts on emerging technologies in the area of lethal autonomous weapon systems. This group is often referred to by its acronym GCG on laws and has met annually since 2017. While the focus of this group has evolved over the years, the discussions have mainly focused on technical aspects, international humanitarian law, and military and security concerns. For example, governmental and non-governmental experts have pursued a common understanding on the core characteristics of lethal autonomous weapon systems. They have also discussed when and how humans must exercise control and judgment to avoid an unlawful or an unethical use of a weapon system. Many have also stressed the need to address the challenges that lethal autonomous weapon systems and related technology may pose to regional and international security. In particular, there are concerns that lethal autonomous weapons have the potential to provoke arms races and to lower the threshold for the use of force. A milestone in the intergovernmental process on lethal autonomous weapon systems was the adoption by consensus in 2019 of 11 principles to guide the work of the GCG on laws. These 11 guiding principles reaffirm that international humanitarian law applies fully to all weapon systems, including lethal autonomous weapon systems. The principles also affirm that humans cannot transfer to machines the responsibility and accountability for the decision to use a weapon system. In addition, the principles call on states to review and determine whether a new weapon should be prohibited by international law. The principles also note that when it comes to lethal autonomous weapon systems, security risks such as hacking, acquisition by terrorist groups, or proliferation should be considered. Lastly, the group highlighted peaceful use of autonomous technology. This means that the GCG on laws should look at technology from the aspect of not only weaponization, but also civilian use. The current mandate of the GCG on laws is to develop consensus recommendations on aspects of the normative and operational framework on emerging technologies in the area of lethal autonomous weapon systems. Work is already underway to seek input from governmental experts on possible elements of these recommendations. Going forward, some of the areas that the group could further explore are: number one, whether existing international humanitarian law is sufficient to address the challenges of lethal autonomous weapon systems. Number two, which type and degree of human-machine interaction would be necessary to ensure that lethal autonomous weapon systems comply with the international humanitarian law principles of distinction, proportionality, and precautions in attack. Number three, the role of weapon systems operational constraints, such as time and space constraints, plays in reducing harm to civilians. Number four, how to identify best practices of national legal reviews of a potential weapon system based on emerging technologies and how to encourage exchange of information amongst states in this area. As mentioned earlier in the video, the GCG laws is a body established by the high contracting parties to the CCW. This has practical and substantive implications for the work of the GCG laws. First, on the practical side, the GCG laws adopts a report by consensus that includes conclusions and recommendations for the mandate of the group for the following year. This report is then submitted to and considered at the annual meeting of the high contracting parties to the CCW. The meeting of the high contracting parties to the CCW then adopts the budget and the dates of the GCG laws activities along with those of other CCW activities. Second, the objective of the CCW is to balance military necessity and humanitarian consideration. Thanks to this objective, the CCW has been considered an appropriate forum to discuss lethal autonomous weapon systems in a multidisciplinary manner. Also, the CCW's purpose is to regulate or prohibit the use of excessively injurious or indiscriminate weapons. This purpose is fully in line with the concerns raised by states regarding the implications of lethal autonomous weapon systems for compliance with international humanitarian law. Furthermore, some agenda items of the GCG laws have had qualifiers such as in the context of the objectives and purposes of the convention. Here, the convention refers to the CCW. Even though the GCG laws is a subsidiary structure of a convention to which states are party, active participation by non-governmental organizations and academia has been key throughout the process. Also, given the interlinked nature of technological, military, and legal aspects of laws, there is a growing recognition that more industry involvement is needed.
So you mentioned private sector and that much of this technology is being developed and is owned by and deployed by private companies. I think that's something everyone understands. You also mentioned that it's not always clear what sort of access the private sector should have to arms control, disarmament, diplomacy. So what's happening? How has the private sector been participating so far, and what are the options for the future?
So the private sector is increasingly a key not only actor, but I'm going to be brave and say use the word partner in this field, because they not only develop, but as you mentioned, they own and operate a lot of the systems, applications, infrastructure that underpins international stability and security, whether it's in the cyber and digital space, whether it's in the context of critical infrastructure, even physical critical infrastructure. Given the level of connectivity and interdependence that we have achieved in 2020, it is unrealistic to expect that governments by themselves can be not only have all the necessary knowledge and expertise, but also are able to by themselves ensure peace and stability. There are so many other actors involved, and private sector is one of them. Not only that, private sector has also shown an interest in, well, first of all, they were the first in recognizing the risks and the challenges, and they were also the first movers in trying to develop solutions at the industrial level. If we think about all the efforts that have been put behind standardizations efforts, like industry-led standards, which is again a non-state actor effort in trying to mitigate the risks emerging from completely unregulated, completely open development and use and fielding of these technologies. In traditionally, private sector hasn't necessarily had great representation within the arms control discussions. And although everyone recognizes that there is the need to increase this kind of communication, there haven't necessarily been any formal steps being taken in that regard. We've mentioned the Open-Ended Working Group potentially at least gives the opportunity to private sector to contribute, but certainly there is more that that can be done. In what capacity? That, of course, is for states to decide. I think it would be difficult to imagine a scenario in which private sector would be making decisions on behalf of states. I think that the decision-making power will remain with state actors, but the ways in which private sector can, as a sector, inform those decisions is important. And I say as a sector because, you know, perhaps there have been instances in which private sector representatives have been brought along in national delegations as experts to feed into the processes, but they will do so in the national capacity. So the idea here is, how do we create frameworks for which the private sector as a whole can contribute? And there are, you know, interesting initiatives that in recent years, particularly in the context of cyber, have shown that the private sector is willing to engage, either directly, if we think about, for example, the Cyberattacks Accord, that is basically a consortium or a grouping of more than 100 industries that are operating in the digital domain that voluntarily sign up to basically have a behavior that is conducive to a peaceful and stable cyberspace. And, you know, for example, one of their most recent initiatives was the development, all signatories to the Cyberattacks Accord agreed to develop responsible vulnerability disclosure policies and make them available. Now, those are the kind of steps that we need the private sector to take as a whole. But also the private sector has been involved in other, if you want, hybrid initiatives, the Paris Call or the Charter of Trust, where private sector and state and civil society kind of all come together to advance discussions or initiatives in this field. But again, if we look at arms control and disarmament proper and this community, there aren't yet any formal avenues through which the private sector can contribute.
And to finish up, is there anything else you'd like to tell our participants? What do they need to know as new diplomats working on this in Geneva?
Well, there are two things. One is kind of the consequence of the other. A lot of the work that we're doing in security and technology is on technologies that are intangible in nature. Technologies that you cannot see, you cannot measure, you cannot control. It's a very different game, if you want, to when you're dealing with more physical parts, if you want, of the arms control ecosystem. Because of that reason, there is a lot of good and bad information about these technologies out there in the open world, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish between good information and bad information. There's also a lot of hype that is generated by media, particularly. There's a lot of like media-driven information and discourse on these issues, and I would strongly encourage diplomats to have a more critical approach towards some of the hype that is generated by the media. Although the concerns and the potential threats that these kind of technologies pose to international security are real, and that's also why there is a very active civil society and advocacy movement behind a lot of these technologies. They come to the debate, of course, advocating their own position, and particularly in the context of autonomous weapon systems. You will hear, if you haven't heard already, for example, the campaign to stop killer robots. That's an advocacy organization that has mobilized not only popular support, but also quite high-level support by influential scientists and people. And that's actually one of the avenues in which a lot of the private sector or scientific knowledge ends up contributing to the debate. If they're not given the opportunity to do so directly, they will find avenues through civil society to make their voice being heard. It's a very polarized debate. It's the sort of technologies that inspires polarized debate, because the threats, if taken to the extreme, can be significant and game-changing. But on the other hand, if we look at the current state of technology, we're very far from achieving that level of threats. So there is one part that focuses on the now, one part that focuses on the what-ifs and the potentials, and there is still a lot to do in the middle to make sure that those very negative what-ifs remain in the realm of the theory, but the technology is given the opportunity to advance and deliver the benefits that it brings.
This concludes our little series of preparatory videos for the Disarmament Orientation course. I hope you found these videos useful and instructive. I'm sure that in many places new questions have come to mind. For some of these questions, you might find answers in the reading materials that we have provided online. But of course, you should also take your questions with you to the interactive sessions. In these sessions, you will see some familiar faces from the videos, but you will also meet new experts, representatives from member states and civil society, and you should pose your comments and questions to them, of course. So I look forward to seeing you there.